and applies to services of every description. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Edward Miliband.
Mr Deputy Speaker, never has the gap between the Chancellor's rhetoric and the reality of people's lives been greater than it was today. This is a budget people won't believe from a government that's not on their side because of their record, because of their instincts, because of their plans for the future, and because of a budget, most extraordinarily, that had no mention of investment in our National Health Service and our vital public services. It's a budget people won't believe from a government they don't trust. And this Chancellor has failed the working families of Britain. For the first time since the 1920s, people are earning less at the end of a government than they were at the beginning.
Order. Quite rightly, I expected the Chancellor to be heard. And I certainly expect the same courtesy to be given to the Leader of the Opposition, Ed Miliband.
People are £1,600 a year worse off. The next generation has seen wages plummet and tuition fees treble. They've built fewer homes than at any time for nearly 100 years. And it's certainly not, Mr Deputy Speaker, a truly national recovery when there are more zero-hours contracts than the population of Glasgow, Leeds and Cardiff combined. That is the reality of the lives of working people. These are the facts. These are the inconvenient truths of his record. It's a recovery for the few from a government of the few. And Mr Deputy Speaker, he chose to make a number of references. He chose to make a number of references to me today. Let me just tell him, Mr Deputy Speaker, we're not going to take lessons on fairness from the Trust Fund Chancellor and the Bullingdon Club Prime Minister. And not for the first time, this is a budget from this Chancellor that simply won't be believed. We support the change on the personal allowance, but on tax, he gives with one hand and he takes far more away with the other. Mr Deputy Speaker, nobody believes this Chancellor when he says he's going to cut their taxes, because that's not what's happened. Not only are wages down by £1,600, but taxes are up. 24 tax rises. Families worse off as a result of his measures, on average, by £1,127 a year. The equivalent of 8 pence on the basic rate of income tax. That is the reality behind a budget that cannot be believed. And everyone knows what's coming if they were to get back. Another rise in VAT. The tax the Tories love to raise. And of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the finest Tory tradition, what's the lesson? Deny it before an election and then jack up VAT afterwards. Now on living standards, which the Chancellor made much of in his speech. The Chancellor knows that on the official measure from the ONS, people are clearly worse off under him. So he's had a bright idea, Mr Deputy Speaker, to invent a new measure of living standards to prove that, in fact, what people know in their wallets and their pockets somehow isn't true. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, people don't need a new measure which pretends they're better off. They need a new government to make them better off. That's the reality behind a budget that can't be believed. Now, what about low pay? Again, he talked about it in his speech, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor poses today as the friend of the low paid. I mean, you couldn't make it up, Mr Deputy Speaker.
It's a little too much noise coming in the back row. Mr Shelbrooke, just because you've moved positions doesn't mean to say I do not see you. The last thing I need from you is to explode. It will neither be good for you nor the Chamber. Miliband.
I'm bound to ask, Mr Deputy Speaker, whatever did happen to the promise of a £7 minimum wage this year? But the Chancellor made much of it 18 months ago. He was going to have a £7 minimum wage, and he has broken that promise. And the idea of this Chancellor of the Exchequer boasting about a 20p rise in the minimum wage, expecting low-paid workers to be grateful. That is the reality behind a budget that cannot be believed. And of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, he doesn't just now claim to be a friend of the low-paid. He claims to be a friend of the North.
Order. I'm not going to keep saying that I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition. I expect everybody to hear the Leader of the Opposition.
Now, on the specifics, we're pleased he's adopted our policy of 100% business rates, councils being able to keep it. But I've got to ask,